You may notice something strange after a deep realization enters your life. For a little while, the mind becomes quieter instead of more excited. Many people expect understanding to create endless curiosity, endless analysis, and endless searching. But often, the first thing real understanding does is interrupt momentum. The mind had been moving because it believed movement itself would eventually create certainty. When something finally lands deeply enough, that movement temporarily loses its fuel. This is why some people experience an unexpected silence after periods of intense learning. They do not suddenly become empty. They do not lose intelligence. They simply stop generating unnecessary internal motion for a moment. The system pauses because it is reorganizing around what has now become obvious to it. Most people do not recognize this pause correctly when it first arrives. They assume something is wrong because the emotional intensity of searching disappears. Questions that once felt urgent no longer produce the same charge. The mind reaches toward old patterns of inquiry and finds less friction there than before. What once felt like hunger now feels strangely optional. You can see this happen in ordinary life as well. A person spends years trying to understand why they feel disconnected from themselves, and then one honest realization changes the way they see their own behavior. The realization itself may not even feel dramatic. It may arrive quietly while driving, sitting alone, walking through a grocery store, or staring at the ceiling late at night. But afterward, dozens of older questions begin collapsing because they were all orbiting the same unseen center. This creates a strange emotional experience because many people unknowingly build identity around searching itself. The search becomes proof that they are growing. The questioning becomes proof that they are intelligent. The constant reaching becomes proof that they are alive and evolving. So when the mind finally becomes quieter, part of the person wonders whether growth has stopped. But growth and mental motion are not the same thing. A tree continues growing during seasons where almost nothing appears to happen externally. The roots still deepen, internal structures still reorganize, energy still moves beneath visibility. Human awareness works similarly, although modern culture rarely teaches people how to recognize invisible development. This is why deeper awareness sometimes feels less dramatic than earlier awakening stages. Early understanding often produces emotional intensity because old structures are breaking apart quickly. Everything feels urgent because identity itself is shifting. But once certain patterns become visible enough times, the system stops reacting to them with the same level of emotional noise. What once felt revolutionary begins feeling natural. That naturalness is important to understand because many people accidentally abandon stable awareness while trying to recreate the emotional intensity of earlier breakthroughs. They think the fading intensity means the understanding itself is fading. So they begin chasing stronger concepts, more extreme teachers, more disruptive frameworks, or increasingly complex explanations in order to feel movement again. But often they are not seeking truth anymore. They are seeking stimulation. You may notice this pattern online constantly. Someone receives a meaningful realization that genuinely helps them become calmer, clearer, and more grounded. For a short time, they feel peaceful. Then the mind begins interpreting peace as stagnation because it no longer feels emotionally charged. Soon they return to endless consumption, endless theories, endless debates, and endless searching simply to recreate psychological velocity. The strange part is that the nervous system often cannot distinguish between progress and overstimulation when a person has spent years identifying with constant internal movement. Silence initially feels unfamiliar. Spaciousness feels unproductive. Simplicity feels suspicious. The mind becomes so accustomed to friction that the absence of friction feels incomplete. This is why people sometimes become uncomfortable around genuinely grounded individuals. A grounded person does not always radiate urgency. They are not constantly performing insight. They do not need every conversation to become a revelation. Sometimes they simply remain present without trying to force meaning into every moment. For someone still identified with searching, that calmness can look almost invisible. But invisible does not mean empty. In many cases, the quieter mind is actually perceiving more clearly because it is no longer spending enormous energy reacting to every passing thought. Questions still arise, but they arise from observation instead of panic. Curiosity still exists, but it becomes cleaner and less desperate. The person begins exploring reality because they are genuinely interested, not because they are trying to escape themselves. This changes the entire emotional texture of learning. Earlier stages of growth often feel like survival. The person searches because they feel incomplete, fractured, confused, or internally unstable. Information becomes emotionally loaded because they believe the next answer might finally resolve their discomfort. But eventually, awareness matures enough to realize that endless mental accumulation cannot replace direct relationship with life itself. At that point, learning begins slowing down in a healthy way, not because intelligence decreases, but because the system becomes more selective. The mind no longer grabs every idea with equal urgency. Some concepts are allowed to pass without immediate analysis. Some questions are allowed to remain open without producing anxiety. This creates a different kind of intelligence altogether. You start noticing that many thoughts never needed solving in the first place. They only needed observation. The mind had been treating every uncertainty like an emergency because it believed certainty was required before peace could exist. But peace often begins appearing the moment the system stops demanding complete conceptual control over reality. That is why silence sometimes arrives before clarity fully explains itself. This also changes the way time is experienced internally. Earlier searching states often create psychological acceleration. The person feels pulled constantly toward future understanding. They cannot remain where they are because they believe completion exists somewhere ahead of them. But deeper awareness slowly weakens that illusion. The mind begins realizing that life is not withholding itself until perfect understanding arrives. That realization softens something fundamental inside the nervous system. Attention becomes less fragmented. Ordinary moments stop feeling like interruptions to some future destination. A walk becomes a walk again. Conversation becomes a conversation again. Even simple stillness stops feeling like wasted time because the person no longer believes value only exists inside constant advancement. Ironically, this quieter relationship with awareness often allows deeper insight to emerge naturally. When the mind stops forcing revelation, perception becomes less distorted by expectation. Patterns become easier to notice because attention is no longer racing ahead trying to manufacture conclusions. Understanding starts arriving through contact instead of pressure. This is why mature awareness sometimes appears simpler from the outside than earlier awakening stages. The person may speak more plainly. They may stop using complicated language for experiences they now understand directly. They may become less interested in appearing spiritually advanced because they no longer need identity reinforcement through complexity. To observers, this can look like reduction, when in reality, it is often integration. And yet, the silence itself is not the final state either. Many people misunderstand this part. The quieter mind is not meant to become permanently passive or emotionally flat. Curiosity eventually returns, but it returns differently. Instead of being driven by emptiness, it becomes driven by relationship. Instead of asking questions to complete identity, the person begins exploring because reality itself becomes intimate again. That shift changes the emotional quality of existence more than most people realize. The world stops feeling like a puzzle demanding immediate resolution and starts feeling like something alive enough to be experienced directly. Questions still matter, learning still matters, expansion still matters. But the frantic pressure behind them begins dissolving, and in that quieter space, another kind of listening slowly starts becoming possible. There comes a moment in inner growth where the mind begins realizing that not every unanswered question is actually a problem. At first, this realization feels uncomfortable because the mind was trained to treat uncertainty like danger. It learned to believe that peace could only arrive after every contradiction was solved and every possibility was mapped. But eventually, you start noticing that life continues moving even while many things remain unresolved. The system slowly discovers that clarity and total control are not the same thing. This changes the emotional relationship a person has with thought itself. Earlier in life, thoughts often feel authoritative simply because they are loud or repetitive. The mind generates a question, and the body immediately reacts as though the question itself requires urgent resolution. But deeper awareness begins revealing that many thoughts are not instructions. They are weather patterns moving through attention. Once this becomes visible, a person starts interacting with thinking differently. They stop assuming every internal movement deserves complete identification. A question may still appear, but now it can be observed before being obeyed. This creates space between awareness and reaction. And inside that space, a different kind of intelligence begins forming. The person no longer lives entirely inside the momentum of the next thought. You can notice this clearly when watching people who are emotionally exhausted by their own minds. Often, they are not suffering because they lack answers. They are suffering because they believe every unanswered thought must remain active until solved. The nervous system never receives permission to rest. Attention becomes trapped in continuous mental maintenance. This is one reason silence can initially feel unnatural after years of constant internal stimulation. The mind has become accustomed to measuring aliveness through activity. When activity slows, the person interprets the absence of noise as absence of meaning. They begin wondering whether they are losing ambition, losing intelligence, or losing purpose. But in many cases, they are simply encountering stillness without distraction for the first time. That encounter changes the way reality is perceived. Earlier awareness stages often make life feel conceptually heavy because everything appears connected to identity construction. Every conversation becomes symbolic. Every coincidence becomes loaded with meaning. Every emotional fluctuation becomes evidence for some larger internal narrative. Eventually, the system becomes overwhelmed by the amount of interpretation it is trying to maintain. Then something subtle begins happening. The person starts realizing that reality does not need constant decoding in order to be experienced deeply. A tree can simply be a tree without becoming a psychological projection. A quiet evening does not need to become a spiritual lesson in order to hold value. The nervous system begins relaxing its compulsion to extract meaning from every moment because it no longer fears emptiness in the same way. This does not reduce awareness. In many ways, it increases it. When the mind stops constantly translating reality into conceptual structures, perception becomes more immediate. You begin noticing ordinary details with unusual clarity because attention is no longer consumed by nonstop internal narration. The world starts feeling closer again. That closeness matters more than most people realize. Many individuals spend years searching for higher understanding while becoming increasingly disconnected from direct experience. They know more concepts but feel less contact with life itself. They can explain consciousness endlessly yet struggle to remain fully present during a simple conversation. The mind becomes full while the moment itself becomes distant. You may notice something interesting when this pattern begins reversing. Simpler experiences start carrying more weight again. A genuine laugh affects the body differently. Silence in a room stops feeling empty and starts feeling alive. Even eye contact can begin feeling more intimate because attention is no longer fragmented across endless internal processing. The person starts returning to life instead of endlessly orbiting interpretations of life. This also changes how emotional pain is experienced. Earlier stages of awareness often produce resistance because the mind believes difficult emotions represent failure or regression. The system immediately begins analyzing how to remove discomfort as quickly as possible. But deeper awareness reveals that many emotions complete themselves naturally when they are no longer treated like enemies. That realization softens the internal environment significantly. Sadness may still arise, but it is no longer automatically amplified by fear of sadness. Uncertainty may still exist, but it no longer creates immediate identity collapse. The nervous system begins trusting its own capacity to move through experience without requiring total conceptual certainty beforehand. This creates resilience that does not depend entirely on mental control. You can see why this eventually affects curiosity itself. Earlier curiosity is often fueled by emotional lack. The person searches because they feel incomplete without more information. But once the system becomes less afraid of uncertainty, curiosity becomes less frantic and more relational. Questions still arise, but now they emerge from genuine contact with reality instead of desperation to stabilize identity. This changes the quality of learning completely. The person no longer consumes information merely to escape internal discomfort. They begin exploring because existence itself becomes interesting again. Learning stops feeling like psychological survival and starts feeling like participation. Understanding becomes something lived instead of something accumulated. There is also a deeper consequence hidden inside this shift. When the mind becomes less obsessed with maintaining certainty, creativity begins opening again. Fear consumes enormous cognitive energy because it constantly attempts to predict and control outcomes. But when awareness stops demanding absolute control over reality, more energy becomes available for observation, imagination, experimentation, and connection. The person becomes less rigid internally. This is why many people rediscover forgotten parts of themselves after periods of inner quiet. Interest returns that had been buried beneath survival thinking. Sensitivity returns that had been suppressed beneath overstimulation. Even joy can begin reappearing in small forms because the nervous system is no longer operating entirely in defensive analysis. The system starts remembering how to participate instead of merely protect itself. At first, these changes may seem subtle, but over time they reshape identity profoundly. The person who no longer experiences every uncertainty as threat moves through the world differently. Conversations become less performative. Decisions become less panic driven. Silence becomes less frightening. The individual starts relating to life with more openness because existence no longer feels like a continuous test requiring perfect answers. This is also why deeper awareness often produces humility instead of superiority. The more clearly a person sees the movement of their own mind, the harder it becomes to fully identify with every conclusion it creates. Certainty softens, defensiveness weakens. The individual realizes how much of their earlier thinking was shaped by fear, exhaustion, insecurity, and inherited conditioning rather than pure observation. That realization does not diminish intelligence, it matures it. And yet the process does not end there either. Once the mind stops demanding constant resolution, another layer of perception slowly becomes available. You begin noticing not only the thoughts moving through awareness, but the deeper patterns shaping why certain thoughts appear at all. Emotional habits, identity structures, protective reflexes, and inherited assumptions become easier to recognize because the system is no longer completely fused with them. The silence between thoughts start revealing structure that noise once concealed. That is why periods of inner quiet should not always be interpreted as absence. Sometimes they are transitions between older ways of perceiving and newer ways that have not fully stabilized yet. The mind becomes quieter because awareness is reorganizing itself beneath visibility. And if a person learns not to panic during that quieter space, they may begin hearing parts of themselves that constant internal motion never allowed them to notice before. You eventually discover that the mind does not only ask questions because it wants truth. Sometimes it asks questions because questioning itself creates the feeling of movement. A person can become addicted to internal motion without realizing it. They move from idea to idea, theory to theory, possibility to possibility, not because each thought matters equally, but because stopping feels unfamiliar. Silence begins feeling like inactivity, and inactivity begins feeling dangerous. This is why many people feel strangely restless after periods of deep learning or personal transformation. Earlier in the process, understanding felt exciting because every realization produced momentum. Each new insight appeared to promise a final arrival point somewhere ahead. The person believed one more breakthrough would finally stabilize everything internally. But over time, they begin noticing that understanding does not end movement, it changes the way movement happens. That realization can feel disorienting at first. The mind expected a permanent conclusion and instead discovered a different relationship with uncertainty. Questions still exist, but they no longer carry the same emotional weight. The person starts recognizing that life was never designed to become completely static inside awareness. Existence continues unfolding whether the mind has finished organizing it or not. You may notice this most clearly in moments where life suddenly becomes simple again. Not simplistic, but simple. The person wakes up, drinks water, speaks to someone they care about, watches light move through a room, and realizes that reality did not become shallow simply because the mind became quieter. In fact, many ordinary experiences begin feeling deeper once constant conceptual pressure relaxes. This changes the mechanism of attention itself. Earlier stages of awareness often train the mind to scan continuously for hidden meaning, hidden danger, hidden structure, hidden contradiction. Attention becomes hypervigilant because the person believes growth depends on nonstop analysis. But eventually, the nervous system learns something important. Awareness can remain open without remaining tense. That distinction changes everything internally. Most people do not actually struggle with awareness. They struggle with strain. They believe being conscious means maintaining constant psychological intensity. So even their self reflection becomes exhausting because it is performed through pressure instead of observation. The body remains activated long after the original reason for vigilance has disappeared. Once this becomes visible, another layer of quiet starts forming beneath the surface of thought. The person begins noticing that many internal reactions were never fully chosen. Certain emotional loops activate automatically. Certain fears repeat themselves predictably. Certain thought patterns appear so quickly that they once felt identical to identity itself. But now awareness can witness those movements before becoming consumed by them. This witnessing changes emotional time. Earlier reactions happen almost instantly because there is no space between trigger and identification. The feeling appears and immediately becomes the self. But when awareness slows down enough to observe the process, emotional experiences begin unfolding differently. The person may still feel anger, fear, embarrassment, loneliness, or uncertainty, but those states no longer define the entirety of reality in the same way. That creates a form of stability many people spend years searching for externally. They believe stability would arrive through perfect circumstances, perfect knowledge, or perfect certainty. Yet deeper stability often emerges through increased capacity to remain present while experience changes. The person stops demanding permanent emotional control before allowing themselves to feel grounded. They begin trusting their ability to move through movement itself. You can see why this eventually alters relationships as well. Earlier forms of connection are often built around mutual reassurance. People unconsciously ask each other to stabilize their fears, confirm their identities, or reduce their uncertainty. Much communication becomes hidden emotional negotiation beneath ordinary conversation. But when someone becomes less internally threatened by uncertainty, they stop needing other people to constantly reinforce their psychological structure. That does not make connection colder. It often makes it more honest. Listening becomes easier because attention is no longer consumed by self protection. Presence becomes clearer because the mind is not continuously calculating how each interaction affects identity. Even disagreement becomes less destabilizing because the person no longer experiences every differing perspective as existential danger. This also changes the relationship with purpose. Many individuals unknowingly search for purpose as a defense against uncertainty. They want a role so absolute that it removes ambiguity from existence. They want a mission that permanently answers who they are and why they are here. But life rarely remains still enough to maintain fixed identity structures forever. So eventually, a different understanding begins emerging. Purpose stops feeling like a rigid assignment and starts feeling more like participation with reality itself. The person notices that meaning is often generated through depth of presence rather than permanence of role. How something is lived begins mattering more than how perfectly it is labeled. The system relaxes its demand for total definitional certainty. This is why some people become quieter after genuine inner growth, not because they lost depth, but because they no longer need to continuously prove it. Earlier awareness stages often produce urgency because the person feels compelled to organize reality verbally at all times. They explain constantly because explanation temporarily stabilizes perception. But deeper maturity begins allowing experience to exist without immediate translation. That silence is often misunderstood by both the individual and the people around them. Others may assume the person has become detached, passive, or less interested in life. But internally, something else may be happening entirely. Attention is becoming less fragmented. The person is no longer reacting to every mental ripple with the same level of urgency. Experience begins settling into deeper layers of observation. You may notice that this changes the sensation of time itself. When the mind is trapped in constant anticipation, life often feels compressed and unstable. Attention keeps leaving the present moment in search of future resolution. But when awareness becomes more rooted in direct experience, moments begin feeling fuller. Time slows down, not because the clock changes, but because attention stops abandoning itself continuously. This slowly reveals patterns that were previously invisible. You begin noticing how often human suffering is intensified by resistance to internal movement rather than movement itself. Fear becomes heavier when feared. Sadness becomes more consuming when treated as evidence of failure. Uncertainty becomes unbearable when interpreted as proof that something is fundamentally wrong with existence. The mind amplifies many experiences through the way it relates to them. That does not mean all pain disappears once this is understood. Difficult experiences still exist. Loss still affects the heart. Confusion still appears. Exhaustion still visits the body and mind. But suffering changes shape when awareness stops building secondary fear around every difficult state. The person becomes more capable of staying present without immediately collapsing into psychological warfare against their own experience. And from there, another shift quietly begins. The person starts realizing that awareness itself has rhythm. There are seasons of intensity and seasons of stillness, seasons of expansion and seasons of integration. Earlier stages of growth often expect constant acceleration, but reality rarely unfolds in straight lines for long. Sometimes deeper intelligence forms during quieter periods where very little appears to be happening externally. This matters because many people abandon themselves during those quieter phases. They interpret stillness as regression because nothing dramatic is occurring. The absence of internal chaos gets mistaken for absence of growth. Yet some of the most important reorganizations happen beneath visibility, where awareness slowly recalibrates how it relates to thought, emotion, identity, and time itself. And once someone begins recognizing that pattern, they stop fearing every period of silence quite so quickly. They begin listening differently during the quieter spaces instead of immediately trying to escape them. Because eventually it becomes clear that not every transformation announces itself loudly at the beginning. Some arrive almost invisibly, changing the structure of perception long before the mind finds language precise enough to explain what has already begun shifting underneath it.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library. each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.